What does it feel like to be corrupt, Mr. Trump? Sarah Jenkins fired the accusation disguised as a question without warning, her voice carrying across the hotel lobby as several heads turned their way, curious eyes darting between the reporter and the former president. She had arrived early, determined to secure the psychological advantage. The morning air was crisp, cutting through her designer coat like tiny daggers as Sarah positioned herself strategically in the hotel lobby, where the former businessman turned president had agreed to meet her for what would become the most controversial interview of her career. One that would haunt her professional reputation for years to come, following her like a shadow she could never outrun. Just get him on record, her producer had insisted over drinks the previous evening, leaning forward with gleaming eyes. Ask the hard questions everyone's afraid to ask. Make him snap. That's when we'll get our moment. Sarah checked her equipment twice, 3 times, fingers trembling with anticipation rather than nervousness. The hidden camera in her brooch was working perfectly. She'd tested it that morning on an unsuspecting bellhop, and her phone recorder was running as backup, nestled in her jacket pocket, capturing every sound within a 6-foot radius. Trump entered the room with his usual commanding presence that Sarah loathed to admit still intimidated her slightly, flanked by a single aide who quickly disappeared into the background after arranging 2 chairs in a quiet corner of the lobby, his movements efficient and practiced. The former president smiled politely, extended his hand across the invisible divide that separated them politically, a gulf wider than the Grand Canyon in Sarah's mind. She hesitated only briefly before shaking it, a perfunctory gesture while her mind already raced with the carefully crafted questions she'd prepared to trap him in contradictions and admissions that would surely go viral by nightfall. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Mr. President," she began smoothly, the practiced words flowing easily. The formality felt strange in her mouth for a man she'd spent years criticizing on her network, a figure she'd described as democracy's greatest threat during a panel discussion just last month. "Happy to do it," he replied, settling into his chair with surprising ease for a man his age, crossing one leg over the other comfortably, as though this were a friendly chat, rather than the ambush Sarah had planned. "Though I suspect you've got quite an agenda planned for our little chat today. Your network hasn't exactly been subtle about its position." Sarah laughed lightly, professionally, the sound hollow even to her own ears. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release as she calculated her next move in what she imagined would be a journalistic checkmate, the culmination of her career, the moment that would earn her the prime-time slot she'd been chasing for years. "Let's begin with your administration's handling of the border crisis," she started, her voice taking on the authoritative edge that had become her trademark, the tone that signaled to her regular viewers that she was about to deliver a rhetorical killing blow. The question was merely a setup, a soft opening before she would launch into the accusations she was certain would provoke a reaction worth capturing, worth sharing, worth celebrating with champagne later that evening. Trump nodded thoughtfully, then provided a measured response about policy decisions and statistics. Facts she hadn't anticipated and numbers that contradicted the briefing materials her team had provided. His calm demeanor threw her off balance, like a boxer expecting a jab but finding only air. She pivoted quickly, too quickly perhaps. "Sources close to your former cabinet claim you deliberately misappropriated emergency funds during your first term," she declared, abandoning any pretense of journalistic objectivity, her voice rising with accusation. "How do you respond to allegations that you're fundamentally corrupt and use the presidency to enrich yourself and your family members?" The air between them changed instantly, electric with tension. Trump's expression hardened, not with anger as she'd hoped, but with something that unsettled her more. Recognition, as though he'd been expecting this exact moment and had prepared for it meticulously. "Ms. Jenkins," he said quietly, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a level that forced her to lean in as well, creating an unexpected intimacy between adversaries. "Did your network send you here to conduct an interview or to create a viral moment? Because there's a profound difference between journalism and entertainment." She pressed on, undeterred, brushing off his question with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "The American people deserve transparency about the corruption that defined your presidency," she insisted, her voice rising slightly, carrying to nearby tables where other hotel guests pretended not to listen but angled their bodies toward the unfolding drama. The businessman across from her remained unnervingly calm, his breathing steady while hers grew increasingly erratic. "What specific corruption are you referring to?" he asked simply, his question hanging in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance. "Name the case, the evidence, the conviction, because serious accusations require serious evidence, don't they, Miss Jenkins?" Sarah felt her carefully constructed narrative beginning to unravel thread by thread, like a sweater caught on a nail. She hadn't expected to be challenged on specifics. Her producer had assured her that emotional accusations would provoke an emotional response, that Trump would take the bait and provide them with exactly what they needed: an outburst, a contradiction, a moment of weakness they could exploit. "Everyone knows," she began, but he cut her off with a gentle raise of his hand, the gesture somehow more effective than if he'd shouted. "That's not journalism," Trump said evenly, his voice carrying a note of something that sounded dangerously like pity. "That's repeating talking points, and I think we both know it. Don't we?" Sarah's professional composure cracked, hairline fractures spreading through her practiced facade. "Your policies hurt millions of Americans," she exclaimed, loud enough that heads turned openly in the lobby now, smartphones appearing from pockets and purses, capturing the moment from multiple angles. The small red light on her brooch camera blinked steadily, the only constant in a situation rapidly spinning beyond her control. What happened next unfolded with devastating precision, like a chess master executing a long-planned checkmate. Trump pulled out his phone, scrolled briefly through what appeared to be pre-saved information, and began reciting economic statistics from her own network's reports. Unemployment figures that contradicted her claims, showing record lows across multiple demographics. Border apprehension numbers that didn't match her narrative, revealing policies initiated during his administration that continued unchanged. Energy independence metrics that challenged her accusations, documented by international monitoring organizations. "You're manipulating those numbers," she almost shouted, abandoning all pretense of conducting a professional interview, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. Her hands trembled visibly as she gripped her notepad so tightly her knuckles whitened, the pages crinkling under her desperate grasp. "These are from CNN's economic desk, dated last month," he replied with maddening calmness, turning his phone to show her the familiar logo of her own network above the figures he'd just quoted, the timestamp unmistakable. "Your own colleagues reported these facts? Perhaps you missed that meeting?" Sarah felt heat rising to her face, the flush of embarrassment crawling up her neck and blooming across her cheeks like wildfire. The interview was slipping away from her control, water through desperate fingers, the viral moment materializing in precisely the opposite way she'd planned, with her as the subject of ridicule rather than the architect of a career-defining exposé. "The American people see through your act," she said desperately, her voice echoing slightly in the now silent lobby where dozens of witnesses watched the professional implosion with the fascinated horror of bystanders at a traffic accident. All pretense of journalistic ethics had evaporated in her determination to salvage something usable from the interview, something her producer wouldn't dismiss as a complete waste of resources and opportunity. Trump's response was measured, methodical, and delivered with a quietness that forced the entire room to lean forward to catch his words. "The American people deserve honest reporting," he said, maintaining uncomfortable eye contact that Sarah couldn't seem to break. "They deserve journalists who seek truth rather than confirmation of their personal biases. Wouldn't you agree with that principle at least?" Sarah's producer would later describe the following 15 minutes as career suicide captured in HD from multiple angles. Her questions grew increasingly frantic, accusatory, untethered from factual foundations. His responses remained factual, referenced, and devastating in their simplicity and restraint, a stark contrast that painted her not as the crusading journalist she imagined herself to be, but as something far less flattering. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the spectacle unfold. The very public dismantling of a media personality who had arrived intending to be the hammer but found herself transformed into the nail. Trump never raised his voice, never showed anger, which somehow made the entire exchange more devastating. denying her even the satisfaction of provoking the reaction she'd been sent to capture. When she finally gathered her equipment with shaking hands and fled the lobby, nearly tripping over a designer luggage cart in her haste to escape the scene of her professional execution, Sarah Jenkins knew something irreparable had happened to her reputation. The interview footage would leak online within hours, though not from Trump's team, as she'd feared, but from hotel security cameras that had captured the entire exchange, supplemented by at least 17 smartphone recordings from witnesses who wasted no time sharing the confrontation across every social media platform. Her network disavowed her tactics the following day in a tersely worded statement about journalistic standards and expectations, removing her segments from their online archives with surgical precision. Trump never mentioned the incident again in any interview or social media post, which somehow made it worse, as though the encounter had been so insignificant to him that it didn't warrant even a passing reference. Sometimes, Sarah reflects now, working at her small-town newspaper desk far from the national spotlight she once commanded, surrounded by community event flyers and local sports coverage, rather than the breaking national news she once delivered with such authority. The most dangerous interviews aren't the ones where your subject loses control, but the ones where you do, forgetting the fundamental truth that journalism requires an allegiance to facts rather than desired narratives. The red light on her old press credentials still blinks in her nightmares, a tiny crimson reminder of the day she became the story instead of reporting it, and how impossible it is to control a narrative once you've become its cautionary tale. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for more content.